All right, guys, this is going to be your review for your chapter 18 and 19, dealing with progressivism, populism, and some other things that are going on in society during the late Gilded Age into the progressive era. And this is going to bridge the gap into imperialism. I cannot stress enough that you can only get so much out of this presentation here. You've got to go back and look at your notes and read your book. So, like I've told you before, this isn't the end all beyond. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at some things that you're going to need to know. As we get into populism and the progressivism, you've got to consider the beliefs and the debates of the federal government's role in policy on economic and social issues. And that's been a continuity going all the way back since we signed the Declaration of Independence, the division between those who believe that the federal government should hold power and those that rely on the state government. And so as you enter the third party system, when Abraham Lincoln became president, you see that the Democratic platform, your old Southern Democrats were pro-slavery and they were for state rights. Your Republicans were were considered radical at the time because they were for Reconstruction. They were for keeping the Union together, led, of course, by Abraham Lincoln. And so when we start getting into problems in our society, one of the things that you're going to see are corruption in the municipal government or the city government, and that's led by your political machines. And we've taken a look at several of these political cartoons that's talking about corruption in the city. So when an immigrant comes off the boat, you know that he or she are looking for jobs, and so they're going to go to these political bosses. And the most notorious one is going to be Tammany Hall in New York City, and the leader is Boss Tweed. And so what you're looking at here, at least these three right here, are kind of three political cartoons, all drawn by the same person, Thomas Nast. And you can almost think of Thomas Nast as a muckraker because he continually puts these political cartoons into the newspapers to draw attention to the fact that Boss Tweed is taking advantage of or getting kickbacks. You know, he gets these government contracts. He gets paid $1 million to, build infrastructure in the cities, which is a good thing. But he's going to pocket whatever money is not used. And so Thomas Nast in the New York Times is going to expose Boss Tweed for that. And this is all dealing with municipal corruption. And so this is one aspect of progressivism. We have a problem, and now we're going to solve it. And he ends up getting thrown in jail. New York City isn't the only place that has political machines. Chicago, Washington, all the major cities in the United States at the time had different political machines. All right. So as we switch gears and we start talking about the populists, remember that the populist movement is dealing with problems in the rural society or the country. So a lot of this is farmers. And remember, the problem with the farmers is that they could never unite. We here up here you can see the Granger movement, the Farmers Alliance. We're not effective because they had a lack of following, and so they're going to join together with several groups. Now you've got to remember that when you see this political cartoon on the test, I told you it was going to be on the test, is that you've got to look from the perspective of the author. And or you were taught that the Judge magazine was kind of a magazine that dealt with satire, and so this is kind of making fun of the populist movement here. And you can see all these little groups that are going to make up the populist party. When we talked about in class for the socialists and the anarchists are way over here. They're not necessarily going to be part, but they are going to attract people from the Farmers Alliance, the Color Farmers Alliance, some labor unions, the Free Silver Party, and they're all going to join together under this one platform. And so you need to know that they're going to believe in they want stronger government involvement. And so the farmers are looking to the government to help provide them more rules and regulations to kind of prevent those big businesses in the east from taking advantage of them. Charging an obscene amount for railroads and things like that. So they believe in a stronger federal government in the economic system. They believe. They do not believe in government policies that would favor corporations. Right? Remember, look at the point of view of these political cartoons as you see them on the test, and even on future tests, especially on the AP test. Their ideology was all listed in the Omaha Platform in Nebraska, which was founded on July 4th. They want the coinage of silver, so they believe that the answer is to put more money into circulation. And so they in the according to the Omaha platform, they wanted to increase the federal government's influence on the U.S. economy, and this really mirrors almost joint when the populists joined the Democratic Party in 1896. You see a fusion of the Southern Democrats along with these populists, which is going to lead to Woodrow Wilson as a progressive, making progressive changes. You can go into Theodore Roosevelt. Um, FDR in the New Deal, government reaching out to bail out or solve our poverty problem. The Great Society program, according to LBJ in the 1960s, and then we've talked about even as recently as Obamacare, where the government is stepping in to help on the side of healthcare. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about the Omaha platform. Groups that are going to favor the populists are obviously going to be farmers. They're going to be sharecroppers, African Americans, labor unions. Some immigrant groups may also be involved as well. And remember, they want to draw power away from the corporates and turn it over to the government. All right, so keep that in mind. All right, and if we had time, we would compare the People's Party platform to that of William Graham Sumner and their Darwinist social Darwinism, where it's basically survival of the fittest. Well, the farmers aren't going to believe in that because they're going to be completely bowled over and taken advantage of. Bimetallism, of course, putting more silver into circulation is also a very important argument. And we talked about how the Wizard of Oz kind of did that with the yellow brick road and those they're ruby slippers in the movie, but in the book they were silver slippers. So the fine line between the gold standard and the silver standard, which of course we get back on the gold standard until the 1970s. Remember that William Jennings Bryan is going to run as a Democrat, both as a populist and a Democrat. His famous Cross of Gold speech is kind of what puts him that he compares the crucifixion of Christ with the farmer being crucified on the cross of gold. So. If you ever see that in the future, you know what William Jennings Bryan, how he fuses those two in 1896. All right, so we're gonna flip gears and we're gonna go to urban problems now, the progressive American politics. And so when you think about the extent where levels of American government influenced by progressive ideals, there are three levels. You've got your local problems, your state problems, and your national problems. And so as we go through this, I want you to think about what categories do these go into, and so you can see all kinds of problems that we see here. We've already talked about political machines and bosses, industrialization, urbanization, and you can pause and you can read a lot of these. We'll talk about laissez-faire politics. We're going to talk about racial problems that occurred during that time, and urbanization and the problems that come with that. Some of the and then of course some of the solutions. I'm trying to see why this is double the development, and then the possible solutions that we can talk about. And when we did the speed dating exercise, you should have identified some of those people that were intricate parts of those movements. And so, thinking about ways that elections changed, like the secret ballot or what we call the Australian ballot, where they're able to vote in private. The direct primaries. Remember, the 17th Amendment allowed for the direct election of senators. And then from a local level, you've got initiatives where the people can petition enough voter signatures to force an election. A referendum is a legislative proposal determined by the electorate. So a referendum would be like, when Katy ISD puts together a bond to build new schools, or when they built the stadium, which was real controversial. That was a referendum that we voted on. And then if we find that our officials are corrupt or have broken the law, we can recall those elections and basically redo them. And so those are all geared towards the local level. All right. Here's a political cartoon on the 17th Amendment dealing with the 17th Amendment, which led to the direct election of senators. Problems in the cities and local. Some of y'all met Lincoln Steffens, who wrote the book The Shame of the Cities, which inspired social and municipal reform. And remember, going along with municipal reform also included dealing with political machines. Here is Robert La Follette, who was considered the father of progressivism, who was a Wisconsin official. And here's a list of the different ideas. And a lot of these you're going to see are actually in our society today. Things like direct primaries, child labor laws, direct election senators. So a lot of his ideas came from, or that's why he's considered the father of progressivism. So here's the fourth party system. Now, next 6 weeks we're going to do another model Congress in class, and we're going to talk about the differences in the Republicans and the Democrats as we head towards as we get into imperialism and head towards the New Deal. So you're going to start getting into kind of our recent politics. In the election of 1896, you still see that William McKinley is still going to defeat William Jennings Bryan, but you see that the Democratic vote, you can see that they're starting to gain a lot of steam heading into the 1900s. All right. So William McKinley, you don't need to know a whole lot for this test. We'll discuss him when we get into imperialism. He wins again in 1900, again over William Jennings Bryan, and you can see that McKinley had picked up a lot of votes compared to a couple of slides ago, where you see him losing a little ground. So the Republican Party is in control, at least of the presidency, as of 1900. All right, so this gets us to Theodore Roosevelt. Now, there's two types of Theodore Roosevelts that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about him as the imperialist, but we'll wait on that until next 6 weeks. But I want to talk about him as a progressive, right? Because he's known for three things, and I call them the three C's, right? The three C's when it comes to Theodore Roosevelt. He was for controlling trusts. That he believed that there were good trusts and there were bad trusts, and so one of the trusts that he ends up eliminating is the Northern Securities. He believes in consumer protection, and an example that would be the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. And then he was also a conservationist. He's the reason why we have our national parks. He's going to hire a guy by the name of Gifford Pinchot to oversee the forestry, and obviously our national parks are mainly in the west and in the Rocky Mountains and into the north into Wyoming and Colorado. So he wins overwhelmingly in 1904. He was the vice president under William McKinley when McKinley got assassinated at the World Trade Convention or World Expository celebration, and he will, because of his popularity during the Spanish-American War, rose to the vice presidency to gain votes, and then he'll become the youngest president ever in the United States. I believe Kennedy is the youngest ever elected, but Roosevelt was the youngest to take over as president. And so if you look at this little political cartoon, you can see this is what I mean by controlling the trust. You can see that he has a leash or restraint on good trust. That would be like Standard Oil, for example, and then bad trust would be like the Northern Securities. So he wanted to tame capitalism, but he didn't necessarily want to end it. And so here, this is him as an example of using corporate regulation. And like I said, the trust that he ends up breaking up is the Northern Securities Company. All right, and then you have, all right, so here he is as a conservationist, and I've already talked about how he created the National Park System in 1916. This leads to the preservationist movement led by John Muir, who's going to find the Sierra Club, which if you remember, preservation is trying to keep the environment in its natural state untouched. And John Muir believed that the government should preserve the wilderness and the areas. Now, remember, these are progressive presidents, so this is the government stepping out to protect the people. Muir also believed in increasing or he did not agree. So if you're a preservationist, that means you didn't necessarily agree with the exploitation of the Western landscape. He believed in keeping it in its pure. He was very concerned about the overuse of natural resources. And anybody that's a conservationist or a preservationist or consider themselves an environmentalist are going to identify with that. So we have a lot of laws that regulate our environment. All right. So moving on. So here's our national parks. Here's a map. Just you can notice that all our national parks are located out here to the west. And here's some stuff about John Muir. You might want to take some time to read about this, dealing with the Hetch Hetchy Valley, which is located in Wyoming, I believe, whether or not they should be preserved or whether or not they should, when they say should be dammed, we're talking about creating a dam that would withhold water. And so when you do that, you're breaking up pieces of, you're not preserving it, you're developing it. And so Muir would have been one of those that believed in not, and leaving it in its natural state and not doing that. All right, so in 1908, Roosevelt decides to step down as president, and his vice president, William Howard Taft, who is going to run for president. Now, the difference between Taft and Roosevelt is that Taft was a little bit more aggressive on trust. And so he's actually going to go after Standard Oil and actually break Standard Oil apart. Now, remember that Roosevelt believed in restraint. He believed in keeping the good trust. He believed Standard Oil was doing that. And so while Roosevelt is going out on his safaris and traveling to the Amazon, uh, Taft becomes a little bit more aggressive in taking apart Standard Oil. He also passes the 16th Amendment, which is the graduating. Well, I say he's president when the 16th Amendment was passed. It's the legislative branches that are doing that on the 16th Amendment. And so in 1912, Roosevelt will decide to run for president again, but this time under the Progressive Party, or what we call the Bull Moose Party, because he basically used was very aggressive going at Taft. Now the problem is that Taft and Roosevelt are going to split the Republican votes, which is going to allow Woodrow Wilson to become president. And don't forget that you have Eugene V. Debs, who was a socialist, that's also going to run. And I believe in 1912 he was in prison when that happened. And so here's the difference in the new nationalism under Theodore Roosevelt versus the new freedom of Woodrow Wilson. You can take time to read those and know what their ideology was going into the presidency. Woodrow Wilson was president during World War One, but as a progressive, he's going to pass the 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendment are all going to pass while he's president of the United States. Not saying that they have he has direct influence in those because it's the legislative branch that do that. He's going to pass a lot of antitrust acts, which is going to restrict monopolies from forming the Federal Reserve Act. So we're going to take our one national bank and we're going to create like 12 little national banks from the East Coast to the West Coast, so that if you live in the West Coast, you don't have to worry about going to the East to collect money. And then, of course, World War One we'll get to next 6 weeks. All right. Here's some more information about the Clayton Antitrust Act and the Federal Trade Commission, which creates the 12 national banks. Oh, here's the Federal Reserve System. So you can see here are the 12 national banks. Our closest one is in Dallas. So, for example, if a bank in Houston was needing actual cash for their bank, instead of having to go all the way back to Washington, D.C., where the original one was, they just have to come to Dallas. And it also helps because as people are moving west on the Transcontinental Railroad, any money that's sent from New York on the Transcontinental Railroad, a lot of times would get hijacked. If you heard about, robbing trains and things like that, but now they have one in San Francisco, so that doesn't necessarily become as much of a problem as it used to be anymore. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson will be reelected as president, running under the mantra that he kept us out of the war. But in 1917, that'll all change when we enter World War One. All right, so as we get into the progressive part, this is the part that we did, like our speed dating, and you did the stations out in the hallway with your quick rides. To what extent did the progressive movement maintain continuity and foster change in American society? So you got to remember, like things like poverty, those things are gonna be continuous, right? They're not going to solve. We didn't solve poverty during this time period. Like people that fought for women's rights, they got women's suffrage, so that was a success. The temperance movement, so prohibition ended up happening for a while, so that was a success. Things like racism, maybe not so much, but poverty, the big one. Even though they do pass some laws to help with poverty, they're not necessarily going to solve it completely. All right, so it starts with our muckrakers, and so our muckrakers tend to be these are journalists that are going to write exposés about the urban problems, political and economic corruption, and exploitation. You can see their targets, monopolies, trusts, corporations, political bosses and machines, and poor living. And so these here are three big journalists. So our books. So like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle is mainly about, and I think there's a slide about it. It's mainly about an immigrant coming to America, working in a meat packing plant, and how the bosses just kind of ignore the pleas of immigrants because they're so easily replaceable. But within the book, you find that that meat has been properly or improperly handled, and so this is going to lead to the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. As we go through here, just talking about different reform movements, the anti-saloon. This slide has to deal with temperance, and so a lot of women are going to participate in the temperance movement. They see this as an opportunity to try to solve some of urban social problems that relate to alcohol, whether it's violence or crime or being lethargic on the job and getting fired. And so a lot of women are going to participate in this effort to do so. Women are going to participate in many efforts: temperance, women's suffrage, because remember, a lot of these progressive movements start in the church. And so this leads to prohibition, which is your 18th Amendment, which is to prohibit the manufacturing, sale, and transportation of alcohol, or what they call the Volstead Act. And we'll talk about it more when we get into the 1920s and talk about how prohibition affected America during the 1920s. The labor unions are going to begin to form because a lot of groups are going to be are going to be for actually better working conditions, higher pay, lower working hours, and so labor unions are going to form, and a lot of them are going to be seen as radical or even as anarchists, and because of different violent activities that acquired. And then the socialist movement is also going to emerge during this time, especially with the IWW led by Wild Bill Haywood, and then of course Eugene V. Debs, we already talked about as a socialist. They're also going to fight for child labor laws. They believe that children need to be in school and getting an education, because one way to solve poverty is to get an education and work your way out of it. If a kid works his whole life in a factory and he has a kid, more than likely he's going to fall into that factory life. Middle class women are going to lead this movement, dealing with child labor. And why do we have children? Why are children working in factories? Well, they're small. They can get into small spaces. They can help fix different machinery, which is going to help corporations, which is an example of social Darwinism. And most people, like I said, when child labor, remember, all these problems are going to be government. How do we solve it? We're going to initiate the government. All right. And so here are some strikes that occurred during the early 1900s under Roosevelt, Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. Um, Here's some court cases. Obviously, if I'm not spending a lot of time on it, it's not necessarily that important. Now, guys, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire is important because of this building that went down. 146 workers were on the 11th floor, I believe, and they were accused of kind of being, going off and taking long breaks or talking in corners. And so the owners decided to chain lock the doors, and when a fire erupted, they couldn't escape, and a lot of them are going to jump out the windows. And so this is the reasons why we have fire drills. This is the reason why we have fire extinguishers and sprinkler systems and all the procedures that go with it. So any law that we have in our society, there's a reason why those laws were passed. And so if you ever wonder why we're going out to a fire or fire alarms, it could go all the way back to this Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. And a shirtwaist is a type of shirt that they used to make, or garments that they used to make. Here's more on the child labor law. They passed the Keating-Owens Act in 1916. So I believe you have to be 16 now in order to apply for the job, even though some of you 15-year-olds might have been hired, a little bit under the table. From a civil rights perspective, we spent a lot of time talking about Plessy versus Ferguson, which established the separate but equal persona. And let me see if let's see. All right. So a lot of stuff on Booker T. Washington on the test. Make sure you know the difference between Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. Make sure you know that Booker T. Washington believed in, he was more accepting of social segregation because he believed that African Americans should get an education in order to be respected in the society. He believed in the opportunities of the New South. And if you remember the New South, where the South would develop an industrial economy, they would expand railroad lines and therefore racial segregation. So they were. So a lot of make sure you know the kind of the characteristics of the New South, but one of their ideology was racial segregation, starting with sharecropping, the black codes, the Jim Crow laws, and then with Plessy versus Ferguson. Washington was a little bit more accepting of social segregation than Du Bois. He believed that blacks had to make the best of their place in society, and they believed that with an education that they would become equal to those, leading to a series of social and political breakthroughs for minorities. Now, Du Bois, on the other hand, is going to believe in, let me see if there's a slide. Yeah, there he is. He believes in action now, and so he creates the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, along with Ida B. Wells, who fought for anti-lynching, and he believed to advocate. He was the opposite, where Booker T. Washington believed in economic reform to gain respect, or advocate for, are going to get equal rights. W.B. Du Bois believed in social and political equality to secure economic progress. Two different philosophies when it came to ensuring your rights. Here's more on Ida B. Wells and anti-lynching. And you met her. You should have met her during the what's it called? The speed dating. Many African Americans are going to move to the north. This is called the Great Migration. This is your you're really your third great no, it's your second Great Migration. The first Great Migration were the Puritans coming over to Massachusetts Bay, and then your second one is going to be the African Americans moving to the south to the north, and they're looking to the north looking for jobs, and so a lot of conflict are going to occur in the north because now they're fighting for jobs with immigrants and people living below the poverty line. All right, so the women's suffrage movement, women are going to finally achieve the right to vote. Now, remember, this goes all the way back to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her Seneca Falls Convention and the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, where they reject the idea that women should focus on the home. They believe that women should enjoy the equal rights with men. They believe that they have a right to earn wages as a positive development. They still believe that women should educate their children about the rights and responsibilities of citizenship. They believe in the 15th Amendment because they believe that they were going to get their rights as well. And so when African Americans got the right to vote in the 1870s, and it won't be until 1920 until they get the right to vote through the 19th Amendment. So here's a famous political, or not political, but a picture outside in Washington, calling out President Wilson, but calling him Kaiser Wilson. That's a German term, and you can kind of look and see the how long must women wait for liberty. And it was in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was passed. Most Western states are going to allow women to vote before that. The first one is Wyoming in 1869. They were the first state to allow them to do that. In 1917, you can see New York finally does it as well. And here's some stuff on women's suffrage. Take some time to read through that. All right, and then the 19th Amendment. All right, another problem is, of course, immigration. People coming to America, they need to find a way to assimilate into society. And so Jane Addams is going to lead a movement, settlement house movement, where immigrants are going to be able to come in and learn English and learn customs and learn how to adapt to American customs and languages. And this is still all these movements are very similar to the Second Great Awakening. And I mentioned this in class in the first half of the 1800s, that a lot of these are going to correlate together. The development of the progressive movement is to address these social problems associated with the industrial society. Remember, progressives are urban and populism is rural. I don't know why this is here. This is not part of your test. You can see the migration numbers and how they fluctuate depending on, obviously World War II, not a lot of immigration. We're going to set quotas in the 1920s, but you can see before that, the new immigrants coming in, going back here is probably raised because of the Germans and the Irish. So you can see the fluctuations as they're coming into America. And then American leisure. Here are some things. We'll get into this when we get into the 1920s. All right, so maybe some things that I left off. So I'm going to go back real quick. Let's go all the way back to urban problems. Well, we'll go back. We'll go back here to the muckraker. So here it is. All right. So for Upton Sinclair, I think we already talked about Upton Sinclair a little bit. So you know, what caused people to talk about the meatpacking industry is that there was no government regulation. So when you go to HEB or you go to Walmart and you buy meat, you know that it's FDA approved. The government is going to approve it, and they were really lax. The laissez-faire politics. They allowed allow corporations to kind of do what they wanted for a long time. So because of this, there's going to be government regulation through the the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. And the other one is Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives. This is a picture book, and so when you on your test, you're going to see a picture of people living in tenement buildings, which are these low income apartments that are going to be shared with by 10, bunch of families. They're all going to share quarters and then share the same restroom facilities. This is going to lead to an increase in reform activities. Basically, what this shows you that there's a huge gap between the rich and the poor, and that the government should step in to eliminate kind of the bad things going on in our society. Okay, so I believe that is all for chapter 18 and 19. Like I said, take time to read through the book and look through your notes. And if you got any questions, then feel free to come to tutorials. Best of luck.